It's Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. Let's start the show with Lewis Tennant. Here we go. Guests and interviews that you're looking for with creators, innovators, and so much more. For all episodes and further info, verbalhighs.com is the place to go.
All right, welcome to Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. It's a podcast. It's podcasted from a dining room table in Wakefield Street, Auckland. It doesn't roll as easily off the tongue as a kitchen bench in Kingsland, Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa, though that might be a muscle and mind memory thing as a result of repetition. I've heard announcers, I think I have announced in the past on a station after leaving a tagline from ye station of oldie. Always awkward. Anyway, we're in the new spot. I'm set up at the table. I'm wondering when a guest comes over. I very purposely, in the other spot, had it set up like a broadcast environment where you are at quite a high-level spot. This is quite sort of low-slung. So it's almost like standing. They were on stools, and I had broadcast mic stands, the ones that you sort of like, for those of you familiar, they're kind of like almost like a mini version of a crane, and they have springs and so on them, so they quite softly move, but it very much felt like a radio environment. So I've got a first guest coming over in this new spot tomorrow night, and I'm interested in whether the effect of sort of sitting a lot closer together will affect the dynamics. We'll wait and see. I'm not sure it's as ergonomically pleasing. I'm sort of crunched up here in a wee ball doing this corrido. I went to a pinball competition yesterday at the Peck Palace of Pinball in Pukekohe. There's him popping on the mics there, isn't there? With that alliterative illustration of the largest pinball collection in New Zealand. We had 72 competitors. I stopped playing for a few months at the wee monthly meets at different houses around Auckland because the competitive side of things, I was getting a little jaded. And I don't have data, but I feel like my game in the comps was not as flash as it had been maybe 6 months, a year earlier. So I think that paid off. I'm still not in the big boy pants league of getting first, second, third, or fourth. I did many years ago when I first found these guys, but I think everyone's just got so much better now. But I did finish ninth out of 72, which I think that's I'm happy personally. I'm happy inside. In my soul. And in the finals, first round, I came up against a gentleman named Hamish from Wellington. I consider myself still a Wellingtonian living in Auckland, so one of the home team. Had to take him out, kneecaps. And then I came up against just the best female player in the world currently, which is Dave's daughter Danielle. It's a real intro of alliteration here, isn't it? Dave's daughter Danielle from the Peck Palace of Pinball, Pukekohe. And, you just know you're going to lose, but you go in with a can-do attitude. And she chose, you see, the way this works is there's banks of machines. And the banks yesterday were one of the newer generation, which is vaguely 90s onwards. One from probably, about 70s to 90s, and then one from before that. That's not that accurate, but let's just go with this, okay? It's accurate enough, especially if you're not a pinball person, which probably most of you aren't. Anyway, the bank had Family Guy, which is a Stern machine that came out when pinball kind of revived again, production rise in the 2000s. And Harlem Globetrotters, which, as it suggests, is a 1970s, a 79 machine, in fact. Seems Danny has a 79 thing here, because she also chose Trident, which is a 79 machine. Nearly got there on the Harlem Globetrotters, probably one wee ball spin off winning, but didn't, and so that is what it is. And then Trident next didn't get the Family Guy, because if you win two, which I didn't, then that's it. But ninth, lovely, right? Okay. Watched a bit of the Who Killed Michael Jackson, or whatever it's called, doco when I got home last night. Seemed terribly exploitative, a little bit depressing. The footage of where he died was really confronting, though, and it just made me reconsider and reflect on just what a tragedy Michael Jackson ended up in so many ways. Whatever your stance on all the different things we seem to have been revisiting about him of late. And then the stand-up comedian in me surfaced, and I thought he called himself the king of pop. I wonder how the inventor of Coca-Cola thought about that. See, there is There's light and there's dark. Had a tooth out on Friday. The guy who did the emergency extraction that I talked about in the last podcast said he'd had planning time this time, so the excruciating pain wasn't as much in the days following. I'm quite functional, thank you very much. But what he had planned was basically, because it's such a large tooth and it's at the back, is sawing it in half like a tree stump and then pulling out each half to get out what I also turns out is the very long roots I have, like extracting a mighty tortura from the earth. And the pressure on my muscles and so on around there was so much that it actually strained all the way pretty much down to the bottom of my neck. And I clung on to the dentist chair and my legs were flailing. It was lovely. But you can't underestimate good dental health, especially post-40. I am now thousands of dollars and months in, but there is some light at the end of the tunnel. Go to the dentist, people. I got myself on Spotify because you can do that now if you're a podcast. So I was a bit iffy at the beginning about providing free content to a big organisation like iTunes. I've done it again with Spotify. I should get out of your way. My guest today is Nabeel Zuberi, who is I put out a call a while ago. I wanted to talk to a refugee. Nabeel, who I know through work in music and radio, said, hey, I was a refugee. I suppose, do you say you still are? Anyway, he was a refugee and came from Karachi in Pakistan and lived in Yemen before moving to England in 1968. So that forms the beginning part of our fascinating conversation about that experience. And then we sort of talk other stuff around what we are interested in, because he teaches media, film, music and the politics of culture at the Department of Film, TV and Media Studies at the University of Auckland. So like the show, Verbal Highs Podcast on Facebook, Verbal Highs on Twitter, you can subscribe and like and leave a comment on iTunes. You can stream on Spotify. All right, Nabeel, tell us about yourself, matey.
This is Dr. Tannen's Verbal Highs.
I mean, just you can talk to me about whatever you want, really. I'm not that bothered. I thought, because you were looking to find out particular things, so I just put those down. Yeah. That's what's been in my mind at the moment. But go ahead, ask me whatever.
Okay. I first found out that you're not, namesakes are a funny thing. You're not the fashion model born in 1993. Have you vanity Googled yourself in the past few years?
No, but on Twitter, what happened was on Twitter, there is a Nabeel Zuberi. I get people tweet me because they think I'm the actor in a Pakistani Urdu drama serial. Yeah. So, and I write back to them and go, "It's not me. You got the wrong one." And they keep doing. Somebody keeps doing it. It happens a little less in the last few months, but yeah, that was funny. But I don't vanity Google myself. No. I wouldn't call. I mean, that's a loaded term. No, I don't. Yeah.
I Google myself occasionally on account of my relatively new career and what kind of comes on up. Who knows how those algorithms work? But I'm safe if students Google me, basically.
Oh yeah, I think I am. Yeah, I think I am too. Yeah, yeah. I just basically look up Google citations as an academic. You know. Yeah. You kind of want to see if people are reading your work, and it gives you a rough idea. But I don't do it that often, you know. Like, I've just resigned to the fact that very few people read our work, and the more impact is really in teaching and the people that go on afterwards, and that you keep in touch with them and develop relationships, and you get, you know, they tell you that what you did meant something to them, or at a certain time in their life. So that's really the most reward. And then at conferences, and occasionally you do meet people who read something you wrote, and you feel that is such an amazing kick. You know?
Someone read it is what you started there with. But you know, it's funny you say that, because I was looking through your work before, and I clicked on the link to your article about dub music that you wrote relatively recently, and it was open source.
Yeah.
And what you're saying about people not reading a lot of what academics write, to me is really tied in with the fact that a lot of that information has basically been withheld from the general public for so many years because of the sort of like mafioso stronghold a lot of those big journal organisations have. So I was really glad to see that work out there open source.
Yeah, unfortunately not everything that I do can be that. It's difficult to do that given the opportunities in academic publishing, but more and more journals are open source, online. You know, they're still they go through a rigorous peer review process. You know, like you get a couple of people reading stuff, maybe twice, maybe more times for you. Because I think we are trapped in these big companies have kind of publishing companies control the industry.
I think of things like, you know, access to information being so different now to, let's say, 15 years ago at minimum. And then you've got stuff like measles outbreaks and sort of crazy, ill-informed arguments breaking out about things online. And I'm like, this is a strong argument for the canons of academia to be available to everybody.
Yeah. But I think the thing is that since academia is so central and integral to a society, right? Well, education is. Then you know, that's one of the first things that people will try and monetize, or corporate interests will want to regulate and monetize it, basically. So I think we're at a kind of a danger point, a crossroads. Like there's been a long, steady decline. I don't in public education, right? Because of neoliberal policies that want to change the ethos, the way we work.
There's a podcast in itself.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I do think there is hope in the kind of openness of much more academic publishing, and like universities not signing up with big production, with big publishing companies like Elsevier. I think University of California has said we're not going to work with you anymore. So these are one of the big science publishers, Elsevier. And
so where will they source that kind of material from? I guess this is part of the radical change that has to happen, I guess. It was via an article, something that Russell Brown linked 2 years ago. I had no idea, and I was astounded at the sort of money that organisations like Auckland Uni or AUT, pay for those subscriptions a year. It's big bucks. So getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, I'll introduce you, good sir. My guest today is Nabeel Zuberi. Do I pronounce your surname correctly?
That's right, yeah. Okay. Zuberi, yes.
Yeah. Who researches, writes and teaches about music, media, film and the politics of culture in the Department of Film, TV and Media Studies at the University of Auckland, which is up the road from where my listeners all know I've taught and occasionally researched the past few years. The author of Understanding Popular Music, which was 2010, Sounds English, Transnational Popular Music.
Actually, the Understanding Popular Music, I don't know why that's still up there. That was a book I was meant to write and I never wrote it.
Yeah, I'm sure I read it.
Bizarrely, I got a...
That's why there were no reviews.
We were talking about academic We were talking about academic publishers, but this week I got a statement from that publisher saying I had 0 royalties for that book, but I never even wrote that book for them.
Bizarre.
So they've got so many processes automated. But anyway, that's not an excuse for me not having written the book.
I think it's a pretty important point in a podcast to point out what you actually have or haven't done. Sounds English, Transnational Popular Music, Media Studies in Aotearoa, New Zealand, 2010, and you edited Black Popular Music in Britain since 1945 in 2014. So that gives a bit of a taste, I guess, of your research interests and life interests as well. You originally commented on my Facebook thread about wanting to talk to a refugee who'd arrived from one destination to another in kind of any era. And this is where I realised, Nabeel, that you know how much I was taught about the history of Pakistan and probably India as well throughout all of my schooling, primary, high school and uni? Nothing.
Yeah, actually, I lived in Britain and in England, grew up there, and we weren't taught anything about that either. So this is one of my big complaints, and something that drives my work a lot as well is the fact that
you're omitted from history.
Yeah, and just whoever is omitted from history, that the histories we get told are extremely partial and huge gaps and silences. And for me, the silence or the way that it surfaces or the way it can be recuperated is really important. Yeah.
Well, then I mean, the bright side of this is it leads me to a very open question. I did do some reading today, but you were born in, if you don't mind me saying so, in 1962.
Yeah,
in Pakistan. Then you lived in Yemen before your family settled in England in 1968, in your words, as refugees. So from A to B to C, what went on?
What happened? My father was a doctor, and he was trained in. I mean, it's interesting because they're migrants themselves or refugees in a way. At partition, 1947, when the British leave
India
British
and Pakistan.
India and Pakistan are created. The lines were drawn somewhat arbitrarily. But after riots in Delhi, my dad's family decided to move to Pakistan. They thought Muslims were going to be unsafe.
From mainland India?
From India, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all on the same continent, so they were all part of one nation. Yeah. But the new nation of Pakistan is created, and my parents felt after riots in Delhi that they'd be safer in a majority Muslim state. So they moved. My mother's family also moved. My dad studied medicine in Lahore in Pakistan, and then he got a job in the Middle East, in Yemen, which was Aden at the time. It was a British protectorate.
Yeah.
And so my mum and dad were there, and I was the firstborn, so my mum took me back to Pakistan to be born there around the family. But I grew up mainly, for the first few years, went to nursery school in Aden. But there's a civil war there, so in Aden, so like a kind of a colonial war against the British. And British decide to leave in 1967. My dad's working as a government doctor, out in the desert and stuff with local people. And he basically it was too violent, the situation was untenable, it was unlikely that he'd carry on his work. So he sent us off to Pakistan and then went to England.
I think I'm following this.
Yeah. And then we chased him. We went there to join him there. So in a way, my parents were kind of refugees twice, and I went as a migrant. Yeah,
the unrest was in Yemen at the time.
Yeah, the unrest was in Yemen, so we went to Pakistan. From Yemen to the UK to join my dad, who thought he might be there for a little while, or wasn't sure if he was going to settle in the UK. But the interesting thing, I was thinking about this based on your post, that like often refugees of often they don't call themselves refugees, right?
That was my next question: is why do you afford that status to it?
So I don't because then it was
professional class,
Yeah, because I mean a doctor, but still we had to move. Basically, we were displaced because of a military situation.
Yeah.
So, but obviously those things are mixed, and that's something in the debates about what is economic migration versus a kind of refugee situation or exile.
I think if you've got no other option than leaving, that it makes you a refugee somewhere else by definition.
So, but I feel like I should acknowledge that now. I guess becoming aware of the refugee crisis and the way it gets spun in various places politically, right? That one needs to kind of... I don't want to claim that I have the same refugee experiences as somebody from here or there, but it's important to kind of understand that that is a condition of people that's really important. That's as important today as it's ever been. So I mean, at other times in my life, I've not been a refugee. I've been educational migrant, I guess, and then a migrant worker, settler, resident, you know.
You've moved about the place,
citizen,
that's for sure. I feel like after reading a little, it's New Zealand's been the longest place you've based yourself for
a while.
Yeah,
I know. This is the city that I've lived in longest ever in my life.
Yeah.
Least expected to, but yeah.
Auckland has that way of... I moved here just through circumstance and wasn't particularly enamoured with Auckland to begin with, to be honest. But
yeah, me
then
neither.
And then you find yourself, well, for me, jeepers, over 10 years later now, because obviously I'm born in New Zealand, but I'm not an Auckland native. But yeah, it's just one of those cities that sort of 10 years later I go, well, a lot of good stuff's happened and I'm working hard and moving up and, But a couple of questions around some of the stuff you've just touched on. I noticed there's one of the divides between Pakistan and India early on is religion, isn't it? Because Pakistan is predominantly Muslim.
Yes.
And so were your family very much practicing of the faith?
Yes, my family were. I think they became more religious actually as they hit middle age, or as their 4 kids entered their teenage years. So they became conservative in certain ways and more orthodox. So I was raised as a Muslim.
With all the ritual and so on, like for me it would have been...
reading the Quran, going to Arabic class and reading Quran every Friday when you didn't want to have another class for the years, completing the Quran, fasting in Ramadan. At first not praying 5 times a day, but by my teenage years I was like praying 5 times a day. So I sort of really believed, but I had lots of problems with it. I'm not practicing now, so I'd call myself a secular atheist Muslim, but I'm not a kind of militant atheist. I have a lot of problems with those militant atheists.
But you still, but there's all that fascinating stuff which I'll get to around whether or not you're practicing just by virtue of that religious background and your ethnic background. It's a really strong theme in your work because there is so much kind of basically misinformation around certain faiths and ethnicities, isn't there?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm interested, like I was shaped in great degree in the UK by the experience of racism as a kid and growing up, and the way that race and racism get politicized as well. So in the late 70s, for me, like punk rock gave me a way of understanding nation, race, all of that as a teenager.
Isn't it funny, a very white working class...
Yeah, that because it was so aggressive and kind of responding to the status quo.
Well, it's an underdog as well.
Thatcher's
Britain versus a working class...
So it was a mix of that and then, two-tone and all of that moment and Jamaican and Afro-Caribbean music and, all of those things helped me to kind of see my situation not as totally pervasive for so many people in the UK and elsewhere. So, understanding race and social justice, I guess, are important issues in my work,
And as I say, getting to the UK from the mid-60s through those 70s and 80s, why wouldn't they be sort of key things? And also related to the art, because there's such well, I mean, it's my taste, to be honest, as well. Like, that whole era of Britain is really related to a lot of the music I'm into.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah, describe the UK of the... I mean, for me, it's textbooks, isn't it? The UK of the 60s through to the late 70s.
Well, we arrived in 68.
Do you remember before that?
A few memories, yes. Yeah. But I do remember arriving in the UK very vividly and all those early years, yeah.
Went from colour to grey.
Yeah, exactly. That's true, yeah. I never thought... It's true, yeah.
Well, Asia's a very colourful continent,
Yeah, my dad took loads of pictures. He was an avid photographer, so he took lots of great AGFA photos when we were in the Middle East. Good light there.
Yeah.
But in Britain, it did go to grey, so, yeah. But we arrived... a few months after Enoch Powell had made his Rivers of Blood speech, which was in the West Midlands, and we were in that area. So, where he said that if immigration continued from the Caribbean and Asia, then there would be civil war and rivers of blood in the UK.
So in the very sparse media environment of that day, you had a target put on your head by some key commentary.
So kids would go, Enoch, 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 like yell at you in the street, and then you'd get, so I grew up with skinheads being around, or me and my brother getting chased around off the football field, and regular abuse at school from people, racist verbal abuse, not much physical. I think I only got into one fight, but a lot of that. So that was very much part of that Britain, and kind of things were falling apart, right, in terms of the sort of post-war consensus. Britain's in debt, the IMF make them structurally adjust, and that's when Margaret Thatcher arrived. So I'm really shaped by that moment of the growth in far-right movement, a political crisis.
Do you see history? You see history repeating
exactly.
itself?
I think that's
what you just described.
Yeah, so it's hard. I mean, every situation's different,
It's
and
bizarre.
there are different issues that are maybe more paramount, but like climate change and so on. But there are lots of echoes, and I think one reason I'm listening to a lot of that music again, and music that I didn't hear the first time, and trying to
What's
think about
that music? Punk or everything around that era, like all the reggae?
Yeah,
and
a lot of it. Yeah, reggae, definitely reggae, punk. Anything really. British pop, Brit funk as well. All kinds of things are happening at the same time. One of the things that I'm always interested in, actually, is the way those stories get told about music and its relationship to the social and political and economic context. We tend to sometimes sediment around a certain set of ideas, and maybe I'm just awkward, but one of the things I'm always trying to think about is like, all right, we know this, but is there something we're missing in this story that we've been told? So, that moment.
Do you mean the kind of narrative for us music nerds around how
music or cultural history,
how culture and music?
Yeah, how culture and music mingle, but also the stories we get told about that music or what was important that time, and so it's more complex. So I think the story of punk is about Dole Q rock, and Thatcherism arrives and so on. So that's kind of become, I'm echoing that, but it's sort of become the standard narrative around that period.
Yeah.
But I think it's more complicated about the different sort of cultural forces, political forces, also the music itself, what people are listening to,
No, absolutely, because as I've already mentioned, that era, particularly with the Caribbean kind of Jamaican area, I know that narrative well, and then you make me think of like the hip hop 70s, early 80s narrative in New York, which I know really well, and that's right. It's all told to me by people trying to do a good job at the best end of it. But I guess like anything, the deeper you delve into a topic, there's a lot of kind of nuance.
Yeah. Well, I met this friend of mine, Casper Melville, who's an academic now. He teaches. I think he's a musician. He used to edit New Humanist as well, a journalist, and he is working on a project about 77 to 81, and really saying that punk is not the main thing. It is really, it's kind of Jamaican culture and sound system culture, really.
Why does that not surprise me? I mean,
and
it's the white man's story.
The punk is in a way kind of it draws on that bigger current and bigger sort of institutional framework for music and culture. The sound systems.
Totally. Even the Northern Soul thing. You remind me of a lecture I saw which talked about pioneering studio techniques, and in exactly the same era, or maybe a little bit earlier actually, as people like Tubby and stuff, it was just a complete kind of jizz over what happened in those Beatles albums. And I was like, this is being presented as like this is where studio techniques developed globally, and I'm like, how can you miss
Yeah. Well, that's
You
why I like listening to. I listen to and play on the radio a lot of kind of, electronic music from elsewhere. Sort of like 60s in. Use of kind of electronic keyboards and things like that in Bollywood music, in Hindi film music, or in African R&B or
the
high life,
Indian guy that invented acid house. 15 years before.
Yeah.
That's a great story. How many of these are out there?
Or like William Onyebor using Russian-made synthesizers as well in Nigeria. A Nigerian producer musician that. Luaka Bop, David Byrne's label, they reissued a lot of that stuff recently. But he was making this really way out synth disco stuff in the 70s at the same time, It's just who writes it down first and makes the documentary, right? So, we have got kind of predominantly American, Anglo-American histories. And, that's what's another thing that they need to be questioned internally, as well as we need all those other histories. And I think, at uni I teach things like the biopic and documentary. And it's audio-visual stuff and video and websites and social media and now memes, right, that in a way generate that knowledge of the past. So they're as important to look at as 30
years summed up in a single frame meme.
Yeah, they're important to look at, as well as actually going back to older documents and the older archives of all sorts of media. So when I think about media, I think about flyers and ticket stubs and photos and promo pictures, as well as not just music video and.
Well, this is it. We've got a visual, because a lot of our degree at the moment is undergoing quite radical change, and we have a paper that is a visual analysis paper that just with no ill intentions or whatever has kind of slightly morphed into a Hollywood-centric kind of narrative film paper. And what you just touched on is exactly, some of the issues that were brought up. It's like, well, if this is visual analysis, you speak of memes, anything through, like what visual is to a student in 2019 is very different to when I did a kind of classical film analysis degree in 96.
I think I was talking about this with a colleague who teaches at Wintech as well.
I sometimes get terrified by how quickly things are moving with young people. Yeah,
and I think there is a kind of... in some ways we were saying film studies has become like jazz was, to people. Like it's it's sort of people who are into film think that they're very sophisticated, and it's kind of a bit snottier than people who study other kinds of media. Yeah, and I'm not kind of trying to diss my film studies scholars, and I teach a lot of film studies as well. But I think you need to kind of... What I try and do anyway is try to think about these different media are really all important in the history and in contemporary life in various ways. And they're related to each other. So we need to think about that, right? And if we know about the ways that we're related to each other, we can think about how culture develops as well. So it's not like a literacy about film is not going to be relevant. But I think we need to study.
It's totally relevant, but it's limiting.
Yeah, it is limiting.
In terms of the visual kind of landscape or cachet of an 18-year-old in 2019.
I also think you need that visual with audio as well. But if you're going to concentrate on the visual, we can't ignore GIFs and the kind of the currency of communication, right, for most people, which is the telephone, interface and apps and platforms. And so, we do have researchers and are teaching more in that and developing those areas. I think we do that in our film courses as well,
Well, I think what a healthy... I mean, if we put our departments side by side, there's differences in the degree, which is probably nuanced, not really that interesting to the average podcast listener.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But what I've noticed, what I've considered, is that it's certainly not an area since about 2000 onwards that one can stay still in if you're going to teach.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like if you taught, I don't know, Greco-Roman history, you probably could sit with the same books for a good few decades for a while, you know. But this is an area where... Yeah.
That was one of the reasons I went into this area.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do like at uni. I didn't want to.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do English because it was too sedimented. I wanted to do American studies because it seemed more about recent decades. And media studies there is a historical aspect to it, but it is about really responding to the present and the current.
Yeah.
And what's exciting about it, it's rather like the music world or the music scene. You know that somebody is going to make an amazing piece of music that you're going to want to listen to.
Yeah.
You're not going to just listen to that Pink Floyd album forever or whatever.
You saw my post about upstairs, didn't you?
No, I didn't. Yeah. So I just think he
plays the wall really, really loud quite often, and it's a great. Sorry, another brick in the wall. You know.
Yeah.
Great album, granted. Whatever. But I'm like, what is there possibly to juice from that song being played loud in 2019? Like classic rock radio has bet that record with, you know.
Maybe they've got an axe to grind about education or what education did to them, you know. Yeah. So it's an anti-education sort of rant. It could be. Some people appropriate it like that. It doesn't strike
me. I hope he's not a listener. It doesn't strike me as that deep. Hey, you touched on the American studies topic, which was actually your undergrad focus, wasn't it? That was your major.
Yeah.
It's an interesting. I mean, what era? What year did you embark on that?
So that was from 84 to 87. So I failed at chemistry miserably at uni.
Oh my gosh, so you were one of those. Shall I do science or humanities?
Yeah,
right.
And because I was an immigrant kid, it's like do the sensible things. That would
You're
go
supposed
science.
to do science, yeah.
So I hated it, and all I did was go clubbing and spend my student grant on records, and I really was miserable. But
did you have liberal parents in that regard, or were you a bit of a disappointment for a while?
I was a disappointment, but they ultimately supported me in making that shift. But I went and did A-levels in art subjects. Then I went to do American Studies because it was about recent stuff. And I was always in love with American culture, with old films and, old Hollywood stuff, rock and roll and music culture, really. So I always looked to America more than Europe, actually, at that time. I wasn't one of those Urailing kids in the summer. And
one of those kids? Sorry,
like that would take the Urail pass. Urailing would go off around Europe.
You'd want to go look at castles and stones.
Or even European cities. I just thought, they're too white. I want to go to America, which I imagined as being this kind of mixed paradise and a kind of thing I'd seen in movies and that you get from music culture, that fantasy.
You wanted to sit in diners being poured bad coffee.
Yeah. But so I went to Nottingham University and I had a really great program, and it was sort of three strands: intellectual history, so the history of ideas that are important in the US, history itself, and literature, which included film as well. So people were teaching film. They were influenced by new forms of theory and analysis as well, like French theory and all that.
People have to remember that, I mean, even in the mid to late 90s when I did my film major, saying anything above and beyond literature would have been kind of radical in university days. Because I think of a friend that wanted to do a master's on religion and hip-hop even in the late 90s and came up just against a misunderstanding wall at Vic Uni, that far down the track.
Right.
So I guess you have you kind of people with film interests, slipping under the radar of literature.
I think it was slower here. The kind of take-up, at least in universities and schools to some extent, but things have moved very quickly, I think. That it was slower here to take up media studies than in, say, the US or the UK.
Would have been right up my alley. I was an undergrad 94 to 96. I think the thing started, my degree, the communication school which I teach on started mid to late 90s, but down in Wellington, pre-internet, I just had no idea that such a thing existed. Otherwise, I think a lot of people would have been suited to it. So was it an esoteric kind of a major in early 1980s England, American studies?
Not really.
No?
I mean, there were small programs. There weren't that many, but there were some that were quite well established at a few universities. And I'm sure, probably the CIA and the US State Department would have encouraged American studies and helped finance that to some degree. I was lucky. I had liberal teachers, American and British, who were liberal, but mainly Marxists and Freudians. So they were great. So they really looked at America from a kind of critical and European tradition.
Yeah.
So that introduced me to kind of ideas of cultural Marxism, that terrible thing now in Britain that's being disparaged by some. But to really thinking about culture and history and how those things connect. So giving a really good framework for looking at popular culture. And
were they that in that era, were they? Because you mentioning Freud makes me think of his nephew. I think it was the godfather of PR. Were they kind of critiquing that side of American culture, like the huge influence of kind of advertising and capitalism, which is one of the biggest, arguably one of the biggest bothers on the planet now?
So a lot of that was critical theory. There is a critique of all of that, the mass culture, mass media. The cultural industries,
the Adorno
and Horkheimer, the Frankfurt School sort of approach to how they are producing the ideas that manage society and manufacture consent and hegemony and so on. So that was a really great place for me to get all these ideas and intellectual traditions that made me understand that things are messed up politically. There's all this injustice around, but how do you then think through what's going on in a schematic way? And even your interests, how they might fit into that, And so music was my prism through which music and film and TV and such to some extent, but cultural studies were my prism to see that.
You just beautifully walked into something that I wanted to pick up on from earlier on, but I thought we'd gone too far, because you went from saying that you arrived in the UK, it was a little bleak, you experienced some kind of like racism and bullying, punk in that kind of mid-late 70s era was a bit of a light, I guess. But then around that, because for me, when I started getting into quite radical music, I sort of took in the political messages on a kind of surface level and got them, but I think I was at an age where it was here nor there kind of to me. So did you become quite politicized by punk, or was it not until you got to the degree that you sort of felt that sense of awareness?
I was probably quite politicized quite early, because my parents talked about politics over the dinner table with all of us. We just talked about that stuff, and they were Muslims and kind of conservative in certain social habits, but they were also very progressive in kind of they were liberal. Actually, they knew people from all kinds of communities, and loads of artists and so on. But they were also musicians. But they
sound like interesting
but
people.
They were very, and they were educated. They went to university and did. My mum did social sciences as an adult student at the Open University, so they politicised us. They always kind of made us aware of the political parties and things going on in the world. We talked about the news, every night and stuff. Yeah.
I was the same. I'm not saying that for a second.
Yeah.
I was more meaning that I think it's as I've got older that a lot of these issues have started. I've always had the awareness, but the deep concern has set in. Set in after my late teens, early 20s, when I was just running around, kind of drinking beer and going to gigs and doing
I
radio.
I hadn't really got I was frustrated and angry, and as a teenager, you're kind of those things anyway, right? And so, I think punk really was the first thing that started to give me a kind of set of tools to analyze how messed up stuff was, right? And the aesthetics of it just were like really hit you in the gut, and the music was very powerful, was very DIY. Anybody could do it. You know, you weren't kind of prescribed this. British society has this sense of like always, you know, that you can't do anything beyond your class, right?
So if anyone could have done it with their South Asian punk bands,
not many. There was.
Were you going to gigs?
I was going to gigs, and
it was as welcoming and open as they say
it
in the history.
Wasn't that, but I don't remember actually that. I didn't feel real racism at punk gigs so much.
Yeah,
there were gigs later where, you know, there were skins and stuff, skinheads and things like that, where it got a bit aggressive. But generally, no, I found that quite welcoming. It was, you know, boys and girls, you know, young men and women, those things. Pretty mixed crowd, gay, straight, you know, black and white.
The oft-told kind of
but not many
crossover
Asian,
of British, Caribbean kind of DJs and so on, and the bands.
But not many Asians or South Asians there. There was a band called Alien Culture that released one single, and then I think the main member became a financial consultant in the city by the mid-'80s. So it was a kind of... There was an exemplar of what kind of happened for many people. Totally the other side, yeah.
Let me see where he ended up after 1987.
Yeah, he's probably in the Conservative Party, you know, now, right? Running for the leadership of the party. But, yeah, there weren't. So that was strange. But I think there were, and that's what I'm interested in doing. One of the areas of research I'm always had in the back, and I come back to, is kind of the South Asian experience in diaspora in America and the UK in particular, but I'm thinking about that here as well.
Okay, so in that era, you can, if you're essentially black, which I keep coming back to because that's my area of knowledge. Yeah, you have the sound system culture. You got the MC, you know, the DJ, so on. If you are white, you've got punk. If you're a young, musically talented South Asian kid in England in that era, what do you do to let that out? Do you just end up being in some traditional...
Well, actually, I think the story
was there a scene, basically, you know?
Not at that point. There were various, like, ethnic scenes that might have been, like, you know, our parents' generations, whether you're Punjabi or Bengali or from somewhere else in, you know, South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. There would be those scenes that your parents, you know, who played in those scenes or listened or, contributed to, participated in. I was talking to Jinder Singh from Corner Shop a couple of months ago in London, interviewing him, and he was telling me how he had gone, basically he learnt music through going to the temple, like the Gurdwara, and that's where, in a way, the Bhangra scene that was bigger in the 80s, you know, the Punjabi Bhangra discos and all that, much of that came from that culture as it then turns into wedding events and bands.
So analogous to how funk and soul and so on came from really tight church bands in the US.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. So some of that, but I think the story's complicated. It wasn't just these ethnically split things. There's always been punks in the Indian scene, they've always been Asians in that punk scene. Although they might be the drummer or they might be, you know, the bass guitarist in a band. So there were lots of bands that had South Asians, or that I realise now had South Asians in them, but we weren't aware of it always.
But then our conversation goes full circle to earlier on when we were talking about how history is presented, because I've watched a lot of docos. I've read a lot of stuff about that era, and I've not seen. Well, maybe I have. I don't recall seeing an Asian presence visually in any of those docos about that era.
Yeah, but you think, what was the biggest biopic of all time? Music biopic.
Oh, in the world?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
It's Bohemian Rhapsody, right? The film that came out last year. I did not know that Freddie Mercury was an Indian, right?
I did for some reason. I'm not sure
I didn't know
how.
that in the 70s when Queen were having those hits, and I was like...
Oh, I get what you're saying.
Old.
Because it wasn't... Why market that?
So I was thinking that would have made a difference if he'd been able to... Never mind the fact that he didn't say he was gay, because he couldn't or didn't feel he could. But... the South Asian aspect, his Indianness, the fact that he's Parsi, that was not there, even though he gets called Paki and all of that. You see a bit of that in the movie now, and representations of him. But, there's a kind of obscuring of that. So I'm interested. There are lots of people working in many genres, disco music, funk as well. Bidoo produced Kung Fu Fighting by Carl Douglas. Produced
that's going to be in my head for the next 2 days. Thanks. That's an earworm.
There's a big pop disco hit by I Love to Love, Tina somebody. I've forgotten her last name now. In 1976 or 7, and Bidoo produced that. So he was an Indian producer who
UK. We're talking UK. Yeah, right. Yeah.
He'd moved to the UK in the 60s and was there for a long time. Went, I think, back to India to record in the 80s. Monochrome Set, I don't know if you've heard of them, a post-punk group.
Heard of, couldn't tell you anything.
So Bid is an Indian guy there. Lots of... Yeah, so in those fields that even are the whitest of genres, like indie pop, from the 80s, the Soup Dragons, Indian drummer, British Asian drummer.
Yeah.
So they're there, and that's why I'm interested. One of the projects I'm doing is on Corner Shop, because they speak to that kind of history and that formation. That there were all of us other Asians that were into all kinds of stuff. We're not just into our ethnic brown music. We're into
but I hope
rockabilly
you just worried me a little. I hope you realise that I was well aware that all and sundry would have been there. I was pushing more towards highlighting how things are represented. So
you're
so
absolutely
vastly
right.
differently.
Yes, Yeah, sorry. I'm taking. I mean, that's the reason. Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to challenge those views of a kind of again, like simplistic histories or histories that have gaps.
Now, what we're talking about sort of feels like it relates, even though this is many years ago, to the PhD topic you turned into a book. Is that fair?
Some of it, some of it did, although I was writing it from a closer point, because I was doing my PhD in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, and I was looking at the 80s and the 90s, and looking at kind of how Britishness was sort of, what does Britishness, and within that really I think Englishness mainly I was concerned with.
So first, I'm just thinking, like, I've put supervisor hat on even though I've never been a supervisor. So is the first one of the early questions, what is Britishness?
Yes. Or how is it? For me, it wasn't so much as going, what is it, but what do people say it is?
What is it?
What is it? What's it? Yeah, Wiley should do a thing for Brexit on that, But so it was, and that was that time, right? Because of Thatcherism really reconstructing a certain older version of, imperial power and so on, and nationalism being quite important.
Yeah.
I was interested in using music. So I was a big Smiths fan, so I wrote about Smiths and Morrissey and kind of my ambivalent feelings even then. But basically I wrote about, kind of Britpop and the Smiths and Morrissey within that, as white Englishness, the debates of that, then what was happening in black music, or what I call black music then. Seems a good as term as any. So in horrible term, but trip hop, the Bristol scene, what's happening in jungle and drum and bass, and I guess that sound system culture, right? And how it's using new technologies and creating this music that's saying what it's like to be black in the UK, right? Expressing that through music. And then Asian stuff as well. So I talked about kind of Asian rock, pop bands like Corner Shop a little bit, Echo Belly, but then about
Asian Dub Foundation.
Politics and Asian Dub Foundation and Fundamental.
Partially Indian. I remember that one hit.
Nation Records, which was their label, and also about also about kind of how rave culture took off. I think I had a chapter in the book called E is for England, which was that line in the World Cup song that New Order did, for one of the World Cups for the England team.
Was that during that hedonistic era they slipped that in,
did they?
Yeah,
it was in that kind of
That's
loaded
like that
era.
Ebenezer good.
It was a bit like that, but it was sort of what were the great political possibilities of rave culture? That some of which got shut down, but some which sort of expressed real were important politically.
Well, I often think about that when everyone, like that late 80s, early 90s era of the UK, when like even reasonably conservative people were on one, as it were. There must be a whole generation of people who were reasonably enlightened by that experience. But then I guess we've been talking about where the UK's politics and so on have gone, so who knows? What's this Brexit up to?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think
how do you feel about it? Do you feel far removed
very
now?
Anxious about it. So, and it's kind of so I have like various pains in my stomach due to that, and then various things depending on what's happening in the United States with Trump, and then other things. But Brexit's been featuring. I think I got really worried when Joe Cox, the Labour MP, was murdered in Yorkshire, like a couple of months before the vote in May 2016, and that was near where I grew up one of the places I grew up in Yorkshire, so I knew that area, and it felt, even though it was that I'd lived there so long ago, that was like one of our own people being killed, in the street in broad daylight. So that really made me anxious
IRA
about where things
something.
were going. And so I'm, I think, and my family are all Remainers.
Are your folks still around?
My dad is not.
Yeah.
He died almost 4 years ago now, but my mum's still around, and I've got siblings.
So you will still return from time to time?
Yeah, I do go back every year, and I still do research on the UK and UK music, and so I go every year. So I'm still very connected to there, Yeah.
The issue would be how do you reverse kind of democratic process that has the people have spoken, as it were.
Yeah, I mean...
It's a quagmire.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I guess there's arguments to be made about the quality of the democratic process. Was it undermined and so on, illegal in certain respects? So that's what the people's vote people are saying. But I don't think that will I don't know if I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't know.
Well, how do you proceed forth in any kind of like referendum or similar public process if you go, no, we don't like that answer, we'll do another one. No, wait, we'll do another one.
I'm coming around, though. I'm not an expert. They'll have to kind of offer that, maybe, but I think what will happen is there won't be another vote. I don't think there'll be another vote. What about
paper, scissors, rock? They could have three. No, they could have... No, I don't mean... come on, that would be silly, paper, scissors, rock. But they could have three referendums, best out of three. Two out of three.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, things have moved on. And the point is, there's no... that one could have another vote, referendum that's properly planned. That was really like didn't have
They can't
detailed,
at this stage.
So
they can't at this stage.
But I think the likely outcome is Britain will leave the EU, and the only way I see things getting better is a kind of real change in the constitution of Britain and like de-Westminsterization of the politics.
What you said before that I wasn't going to touch on because it's such a huge topic. I mean, if we look at what's been happening in the US and in the UK, and admittedly different contexts and so on, you just said, well, maybe there's something with democracy, and it's like it's such a vast chasm of a topic. But I have considered that, like, maybe these systems in this era aren't working for us as they arguably might have better before.
The worrying thing, though, is what then is thought to replace that.
I think dismantling democracy and replacing it with something else.
Yeah, I think when maybe it's not dismantling democracy, actually. It's kind of enabling it, right? If you have a system
you
and then you...
making it healthier.
Yeah, so, making more decisions and budgets at the local level. Centralisation has been bad, right?
Yeah.
I think. And so people feel detached from London and the South. And
it's a very big corporation approach to running society.
So I think... I agree with people like Billy Bragg, for example, who say we should have more assemblies and kind of make politics more ordinary and localized than it is. I think it has broken, though, the democracies in many of these states because I think of, governments basically adopting neoliberal policies mainly.
Yep. Greed, capitalism, corporate power... lack of community.
Yeah, corporate power, and also, attempt to kind of basically commodify everything in human life. Right?
My unashamedly political economy approach to looking at everything, but there's something in it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fundamental. I don't think. I think that's the Marxism is useful. Kids out there listening.
Yeah.
To understand to understand what's going on in terms of political economy, that has to be there, even in a cultural analysis.
Have you seen the "I Told You So" T-shirts? There's a great T-shirt with Marx on it with "I Told You So" written below it.
That's probably more, but that's too smug for Marx. I don't think he'd ever be that smug. He'd be going, "I told you so," but there's probably I have to solve this problem here that doesn't quite fit. So. I mean, I think democracy... what I was saying about it's worrying right now that there is clearly a breakdown of democracy and a lack of faith in it because it's so corrupt, right? And structurally broken. But the class division, the kind of divisions in wealth and access and precariousness of everyday life is much greater. So precarious employment is defining more of our... students' life, precarious health as well, and mental health as well, all kinds of health, I think are major issues.
Everything to a far greater extent than when I was at uni has kind of been monetised, and that's a huge pressure, Just I look at what...
But I think they are politicised, but in different ways, and you can see it in things that they're doing and the way that they're active in social media and making culture.
The last few years, students I've seen feel more politicised and concerned than the students I was teaching 2011 to about 2015. They feel like more the art students of my era.
I think because, there's the threat to the planet, right?
Yeah.
Or we're going to we've destroyed the planet, or or done a really good job at trying to do that.
There's also, I think, like I mentioned earlier on, I think media diet plays a huge part in it. And I thought when the students I first started teaching, like, there's a very reality TV diet, which there still is now, but it really dominated the landscape. So they grew up on like that Paris Hilton show and that era of programming. And I think there's a lot more people kind of emulating that than I see happening now.
I agree with you. I think there's been a shift.
Yeah.
They seem more like sort of, a lot more kind of National Party kids back in the day.
Yeah, well,
and
yeah,
that's changed. I
yeah.
think there's less smugness. I think amongst like there's always going to be one or two people who are a bit smug in one's classes, but there seems to be less of that smug vibe from some people, and more respect for other people's voices in a class and so on.
Part of that also I've kind of noticed is when I said it's sort of returned to more what I recognise as a traditional BA cohort, is there's a lot less kind of cookie cutter similarity. I'm starting to get kind of people who more diversity in kind of dress and style, and
I think that's true.
Because we're at quite different institutions in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
but it's interesting.
I mean, there's those institutions are always going to be different, but I think that it has improved. I think probably the 2008 global crisis and what it's done to the economic prospects and thinking about work and the future.
They're getting woke. They're getting woke.
Is that's had some effect. So we're probably seeing a generation marked by that.
Okay, now we're comparing crudely written notes on students done in crayon on serviettes.
They're all great. They're all fantastic.
They're all fantastic.
I love my students.
That's right.
Yeah, they're great.
Well, you did say you loved teaching at the beginning, which I found heartening, because there can be two camps there. But attention span, that's the thing that, in terms of, we're going to talk like pedagogy and teaching and, touching on, I guess, a bunch of stuff we've kind of visited during this podcast. I just wonder whether the new ways that media is used, the length of time people engage with things, the amount of devices they engage with, I wonder whether the traditional lecture is going to remain in the long term.
People are, multitasking and flitting between different screens, and attention is moving between things much more.
Yeah,
I think we recognise that in our own everyday lives as well, right?
Oh, I'm shocking, yeah.
So, but yeah, I think that's what I think a lot of our institutions are doing, is trying to address that. There is a place for the lecture still. It does something quite well as a kind of pedagogical instrument, but it should just be one tool among all the others. The problem right now, which I'm sure you're facing as well, is having space, a design of spaces, right? Teaching rooms that accommodate these different forms in smaller undergraduate teaching. And also, I've always, when I've had a postgraduate class to do, is just basically get as much away from that PowerPoint standard AV delivery and someone at the front of the classroom, and just sit around a table. I
love it. Same.
That seminar, because that's the way I was trained in grad school in America as well, was you read something and watch something usually, talk to your mates who were in the class about it, and then went and really intensively looked at that. And
shoots were smaller as well, though. It was easier.
Yeah, so it's easier to do with graduate courses, of 10, 15 and something like that.
Have you walked through, well, it's not so new now, 2012, it's new for a building. Have you walked through our new building? Had a look through our new building?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Beautiful lecture theatre, Nabeel. Beautiful room. Lovely room.
When you say new, which one do you mean?
Well, 2012 WG, the one I'm in.
Yeah. That one, yeah. I've actually gone to a symposium there on Afrofuturism, yeah. So I went there a few years ago.
The building. Yeah. The part of the, as you responded, I thought the part of the changing attention spans, or just changing approaches to learning and life and whatever it is, and I know this has been a problem since the dawn of students being set stuff to do in their own time, but I worry that the reading material is getting less and less engaged in, and sort of coming through in assignments and stuff, but I don't know.
Yes, that is a challenge, I think.
Because they're very big, old-fashioned looking documents now, but they're very necessary.
Yeah. So I think we try and, I think for me, I think they have to engage with that difficult academic literature as well.
Well, how else do you get a degree?
But also you moderate that with other reading, or give them different types of academic writing as well, so they can think, all right, that works for me. Some stuff Adorno and Horkheimer or reading French theory might turn you off, but it might actually really turn you on as well. So I want to give them different models of academic writing and approaches, as well as some quality journalism as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of us at undergraduate level are doing, one of each, say, to the students, getting them to read something that's more meant for a general audience and alongside a more traditionally scholarly article.
Hey, if you haven't studied since 1982, stick with us, folks. This is very specialised.
We can talk about something beyond the university.
We can, and we absolutely have. Record Store Day. You just said, you mentioned to me you wanted to talk record stores, full stop. So that we're kind of wide open there.
Yeah, well, that's because I knew you'd done that stuff for your PhD, right?
Yeah, seems like so long ago.
And I needed to get your expertise on this as well, because I'm writing a piece on the record store for a big collection on music and place. So friends of mine gave this assignment to write a chapter on the record store, and I was like, wow, that's like my dream assignment. I've spent more hours there than I have in the bathroom or something in record stores practically. Yeah. But it's it's sort of imposing. There's a burden of representation because I feel I really have to be true to the institution and the place of the record store.
Well, when you say record store and place, that kind of sounds like a large element of my PhD. But is it about a particular record store or your experiences of record stores? No, I think
what I'm trying to do, because it's like written for a kind of a companion or a handbook, then I have to be general or try and get an overview of this thing called a record store, right?
Yeah.
So I think the first place I sort of started off was trying to think about, well, what is it that we actually call a record store, a record shop? I think in a way, because of firstly, I think because they're dying, right, in general.
Strong word. But yes.
Or becoming less and less important, fewer and fewer. We need to think about, well, what actually has constituted a record store? So the vision
historically or since because it's funny you use that term, because I touched on that in my research, was that the power of kind of language. Like there was an article, not that say this wouldn't have happened anyway, but there was an article published called "The Death of the Record Store," and that became part of the lexicon for many years. There's a sort of they're dead, they're dying. It's sort of like a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So there's a problem with that, but that's what. So I think I start my essay with something. Somebody said to me when I was saying I was writing this, like, do they still exist, record stores?
Yeah.
And this was somebody saying it seriously rather than facetiously. So, but I think that discourse has tended to dominate. So there is a problem with that. And now what I was trying to think about is, if we look at the history of the record store, we might think of all these quite diverse spaces as, in some ways, record stores. So, a department store.
That's right, and they all, in terms of what you're focusing on about them and or the value of them. That's right. There are very different stores. I certainly wasn't writing about, like, I don't know, putting myself on the spot here, hanging out at kind of JB Hi-Fi. When I spoke about the social aspects, not that there aren't those there, but I don't know. You got to be very careful with that topic, that it doesn't become and I know you'd know this as a competent academic, but that doesn't become kind of an exercise in nostalgia.
Oh no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
Why I was thinking historically is that I think the fact that partly Record Store Day is to blame, I think, but. And the fact that...
Hang on, what are we blaming things for?
Well, not blame.
What's died? What are we blaming things for?
No. Partly because of so many memoirs, so much representation of independent stores. Look, you go to videos online.
Yeah.
And that's great, because I think independence and not being a corporate, music retailer is important. But that has also obscured the kind of range of different places where people have bought music and listened to it and socialized around it. So that can be the stall in an Indian market, or the Sunday market in selling bootleg CDs in Mexico City, or it can be the department stores where they try to recreate salon listening, right? And
Is this in living memory?
Well, no. People who've written about early recorded music and records shopping and selling have said
the record bars in department stores.
In department stores, women were actually the ones mainly selling records to mainly other women consumers. So we tend to have this view of the view of the record store is a bit dominated right now by the high fidelity, the middle-aged guys and young guys occupying an independent record store, because that's got the most romance and hype around it, and that's really important and has lots of pleasures. But I think one of the things I wanted to get to is like the record store will survive in some new form. They've constantly been changing their coffee bars, their restaurants, I've been to. Yeah,
you need something else. I mean,
a pasta bar and
real groovy. I mean, you can't. They do it tough. I mean, they've moved 3 times since I've lived here, but they are, an example of a place that does just that. And I guess actually, maybe Auckland's not a great example because Southbound are as well. But yeah, you want to be, like in the case of what Kyan's got in Raglan now, he's got some of his partner's art as well as the records. Or you want to like cut someone's hair while they're there. There's like a great kind of. Like a great barber, or there's got to be other, in terms of the social aspect that's really important. This is the way I see it anyway. The social aspect that's really important, but not just because they're shutting down, but particularly now that we are arguably less social creatures overall. Something else. It's not just about that
buying of music,
romanticism of buying and selling music. It's to me, it's about and I never expected my work to be about that either. It's about, my interest was in, like, we're kind of losing physical social spaces.
Absolutely.
Either A, who cares, or B, how does this change us?
I was thinking about Record Store Day, which I have really ambivalent feelings about, because I want the record stores to be promoted and to do well, but there's also this kind of frenzy of it it's like a bit of a sales day, like, and kind of manic consumer behaviour. But I realised...
And the majors kind of, for people who don't know, the majors kind of repressing heavy versions, thick vinyl versions of kind of dad records.
All of that.
Tying up the presses.
Yeah, but in the morning, like I, got ready, went out early, and I was thinking about it like, today I'm going to meet these people. It was about the socialising. I was going to go to Conch first and hang out there and meet friends and DJs and people selling records and talk about music or whatever
It's
else.
always like, who's out the front there, and probably 9 times out of 10 I'll know one of them. So I also, the other thing that I'm interested with record stores is that they are, as social spaces, they're these weird, they're like sort of time machines, they're kind of libraries, they're, these weird archives that have been ordered by sometimes in pretty standardized ways, but also idiosyncratic ways by the owners, or depending on where they are. And like, you're exposed to so much other sort of knowledge, you get to see bands sometimes there, or you get to read interesting zines and you bring up another thing, probably especially now, like, a lot of them I don't like the atmosphere of. I don't particularly like sort of a grumpy old guy, and a lot of it's about whether it's a record store or, I don't know, a panini shop. It's about the attitude to how the business is run.
Yeah.
So if you want to preserve those elements around what we've been talking about, you've got to have a proactive owner that.
Yes.
Sort of, I think it was a great line from Chris, who I'd never met before the PhD, who came into one of the data sessions. I can't remember whether it was the one that you, anonymous participant, were in as well. But he said something like, well-run record stores are really good, but some of them ride a fine line between business ownership and a mental health issue. And I just it's really funny because I just pictured the kind of like the shop that should have shut years ago, and this poor guy somehow is holding on to it and paying the rent, and
no, I think that is vital, like what kind of atmosphere. And I don't read much of this sort of business management MBA type literature, but when I was doing a literature search for kind of music retail, there were lots of people writing in in that area about kind of mood enhancement and how do you create the right space in which people will, you know, consume
the correct aroma for
consume you know, the sort of design of the space as well. So that's fascinating. I guess you can only I can just talk to how they operate in different places, and what's wonderful is how record stores are so varied, right? You go to one record store that feels like you're in a monastery. It's so the walls are black, you know. In Berlin, Spacehalle, black walls. You can look at rows and rows of techno and house records, and it's sort of a bit like you're in a laboratory. Whereas others are more like, you know, DJs going, or the people behind the counter telling you,
like
that's
that classic sort of Jamaican model, right? Throw them down. I'll take that. Yeah,
you'll like this if you like that. Listen to this, check this out. So
we're nearly there. Amazing, 80 minutes. You've revisited me thinking about, or you've made me revisit thinking about my PhD, which I need to do because I've just got. We don't have tenure in New Zealand, but a full-time gig where I am.
Congratulations!
We're researchers. I wasn't fishing for a compliment, but thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
We're researchers now, very much an ongoing role in my job. And you kind of terrified me a little before when you said you kind of went straight from your PhD to writing your book. Like, I'm faced with a problem at the moment where I finished my PhD in 2016, and I've published one article, but I can't even bring myself to do research at the moment. Like, have you had periods over the years where you get off that bike? And I just need some advice, Nabeel. I did an MPhil and a PhD, and I was feeling quite guilty about it around work. And one of my kind of superiors, colleagues and friends, said, "You've just done a PhD and an MPhil. Don't be so hard on yourself." Yeah. But then 3 years have passed now, and I've been lately in the last few weeks really, feeling a kind of guilt about the fact I can't.
Yeah, I think that's and this is the situation of academia as well, right? That it makes us anxious in those ways because even though you're working full tilt in these different areas, something gives, and then you feel anxiety about it. I mean,
but then there's nothing worse than frittering away all this time and like.
Well, you haven't frittered it away. I think the thing is that, I mean, I'll
tell
tell
you
what
look
happened.
On Facebook, you realise
I'll tell you what. Yeah, you do fritter away time. I do that as well. But I think the thing is that when I finished my PhD, I came here with that. That got me the job here, right? That I'd got a PhD in America and had taught a fair amount while doing the PhD. So when I got the job here, I knew that in order to get out, to leave the job, I'd have to publish quite a lot. So in a way, the book from something I'd already done was.
What do you mean to get out of Auckland?
To get out of Auckland, New Zealand, or move?
Right,
Because I imagine I'd be here for 3 years and then move away, back to the States or somewhere else. So I was in a real desperate hurry to get that done.
Right.
I was also
you had
teaching.
A flame under your ass, as they say.
Yeah. I also had a full teaching load, but I was really stressed. And after I did that, got the book out, I almost moved back to the States, but then decided to stay. Then I just went, and I was still, teaching a full load and everything. But I went, listen, I can only do. I've got to come to terms with how much work I actually want to do or will get done. Now that you have research, now that you're a researcher and someone who's going to get funded for it, then, it's an opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
And then, it depends on, I guess, planning what you really want to do for that while, right?
Yeah.
Like what the projects are that are sustainable in the institution and for you personally.
Yeah, thank you. I don't get too boffiny for our listeners again, but I'll talk to you a bit more after. But I even worry about the other major piece of work I did was 2012, and there's been no articles from that, and that's a long time. You don't want something to kind of go stale.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, Nabeel, one last thing I want to touch on. I think you've basically sounds like the way you ended up here was there was a job advertised in New Zealand, which you took.
Yes.
Is that,
Yeah.
Why did you end up staying?
Well, my partner also is working here, so
Yeah.
for both of us to move, it would be hard.
Yeah.
And I think we've made friends here. We like, the air and the environment,
Yeah.
and we've always had really good colleagues, and the hard thing about it, good everyday workmates.
The hard thing is it's not the most vibrant
Yeah.
city in the world.
The hard thing, yeah, but as you get older, you don't care about that so much,
Oh,
right?
I could do with a Notting Hill kind of thing once a year. We've got enough diversity here.
Yeah. But I think it's the more as the years have gone by, the more New Zealand seems sane and moderate, and there are lots of problems here, but there's a kind of relative sanity
And distance.
Yeah, the distance is bad, but
No, it's good. It's good
sanity,
for kind of what you're talking about.
yeah.
If it all goes to custard.
Yeah, and I've travelled and been in other places, so for me, as long as I can leave regularly, I'm happy to live here. The quality of life, everyday life, is really good.
Thank you, sir. That was a great conversation, and thanks for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.